Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Carolina.
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on having a basic understanding of neuroscience being essential. And to enlighten us on this topic is a very special guest, Dr. Ginger Campbell. Dr. Ginger Campbell hosts the award-winning podcast Brain Science and Books and Ideas. Dr. Ginger Campbell is also a physician and has published a book on the unconscious origins of certainty, whose focus is on understanding the neural basis of perception and the world and our biases. So, welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and the main motivation for choosing today's topic?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I actually launched Brain Science a long time ago, 2006. It was originally called the Brain Science Podcast. I started Brain Science because I was really frustrated with the mainstream media coverage of neuroscience, full of hype and misinformation. So my goal was to just get the facts out there, you might say, and also make them accessible to non-scientists. And so that's what I've been doing for almost 16 years. And I do it because I really think having a basic understanding of how our brain really works is important to being a good citizen in the 21st century.
Absolutely. And as we all know, you've been very successful in communicating neuroscience to the general public. It's an incredible podcast.
Yeah, we're both huge fans of your podcast.
Mhm.
And it's also great to hear that your reasoning for starting the podcast is similar to ours in that we were a bit fed up of all of the misinformation in the media about neuroscience. And we're very aware of the importance of communicating that to the general public.
Admittedly, our content is not as lay as other science podcasts. It's so amazing that your podcast is accessible to everyone and really tackles a lot of the science misinformation out there.
I'd love to hear a little bit about what brought you to neuroscience in the first place and what sparked your interest.
Mhm.
Yeah, first of all, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a neurologist, and I'm also not a neurosurgeon. I've been mislabeled neurosurgeon from time to time. Don't know why people think neurosurgeons are so romantic, but anyhow, I was an ER doctor and now I do palliative medicine. So it's not my day job, you might say. What got me interested in it was I was interested in consciousness, and I had spent many years exploring Eastern philosophy. And about 20 years ago, I sort of hit a brick wall, you might say, in the Eastern philosophy approach, because it was all this stuff about, 2000 years ago, someone had all the answers. And I'm like, there's got to be a place for incorporating new knowledge, incorporating what we have, discovered in the last 2000 years, right? And I started reading for the first time in my life Western philosophy. And I discovered that there's a whole branch of Western philosophy called philosophy of mind. And this is where a lot of people went back when consciousness was considered something you couldn't study scientifically. People like Patricia Churchland, they went into philosophy instead because they were interested in consciousness and it was too soon for it to be considered scientific. Now that's changed in the last 30 years. And actually, that's what I discovered. So once I had really explored philosophy of mind, I realized, hey, lots happened in neuroscience since I went to medical school back in the 80s. And so I started reading actual neuroscience. And then what happened was, this is in the early days of podcasting, there was a show, it was called the Sci-Fi Zone. It was a guy in Australia, and it was about the intersection of philosophy and science fiction, actually. But he kept talking. He had, back then, discussion forums were popular. It was before Facebook. There'd be people having these conversations about the brain, and they'd be saying stuff that was wrong. And I'd go, well, if you would just read X book or you'd read Y book. And finally, he's like, why don't you just do a book review? And that was actually what led to the show. Was I did a book review, a book called On Intelligence by Jeff Hawkins. And that was it. I was like, oh, this is it. I could do this forever. I mean, I won't run out of topics. Mm-hmm. So that's how I got both into neuroscience and into doing a podcast about neuroscience.
Amazing. Can I ask specifically why neuroscience? Like, what do you believe it is within the quality of neuroscience that gives us so much knowledge and understanding and value in our life as compared to, for example, biology or physics?
Yeah, I think physics makes a great contrast. For example, quantum mechanics, doesn't have much impact on our daily lives, right? In contrast, neuroscience is telling us things about what makes us human and why we act the way we do. And this is really important. For example, memory doesn't work the way most people think it does. It's actually very dynamic. Every time you recall a memory, your brain basically recreates that memory, which means it's incorporating new information, which means your memory changes. Well, so that means that when we talk to somebody, it's normal that their story or description of an event is going to change over time. So we shouldn't say, oh, you changed your story, therefore you're a liar. No, you changed your story, therefore you're human. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's just a simple example of why I think understanding how the brain works is most of us want to understand ourselves. And really, the brain is kind of the key. It's not by itself, it's part of a whole system, but still it creates the world we experience. The most important thing, I think, is that it should give us both compassion and tolerance toward ourselves, but also compassion and tolerance toward other people, which we need more of in today's world, right?
Absolutely. And I noticed that this was a very big topic in your book, and especially when you cover talking about sense of being right and the illusions of self-belief on being right, and how it's a reward circuitry system.
Right. Yeah. I found it really interesting how you described the purpose of this feeling of knowing in guiding our learning as humans. Could you give us a little bit more information about this?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to give credit where credit is due. This idea was not original to me. My little book was actually based on interviews and the writings of another person, Dr. Robert Burton, who's a retired neurologist, and he's actually written a couple of books. And when I wrote the book originally, because this was the second edition I recently released, he gave me permission to do this. So it's really Dr. Burton was the one who realized this idea that this feeling of certainty, which we don't think about, but we've all experienced, that moment when you go, aha, yeah, I've got it. I know, and it's a very definite feeling. But the important idea is that that's not generated by conscious effort. Actually, most of what our brain does is unconscious. So the fact that this is generated unconsciously should not surprise us, but probably does, because traditionally, actually, psychologists thought that everything the brain did was conscious. I mean, the first person who suggested that visual processing might be unconscious was rejected, because at that time, they actually thought visual processing was conscious, which, of course, we now know is not true, but that's what we once thought. So we've gone from thinking almost everything is conscious to appreciating that most of what our brain does is unconscious. And the reason that this is important is it means you don't control it. You didn't choose to believe or not believe. I mean, we all tend to think I'm the one that has the truth, and anyone who disagrees with me is wrong. But if we take into account how our brain really works, we need to be more humble about it. That's what Dr. Burton says. He says we should be humble because we could be wrong.
Yes, I noticed also that Dr. Burton says that the feeling of knowing and feeling of familiarity are integral to learning. And he also, as you mentioned in your book, goes on to talk about other examples and how certainty is contrary to basic biological principles. And especially one thing that really stood out for me is questioning, I guess, our education system and how we rely so much on knowing and having this belief that we are right, and the binary structure of school, and that something is either right or wrong, as opposed to encouraging open-mindedness and that it's okay to make mistakes and it's okay to think outside the box or not exactly have the right answer, and how it's a bit counterintuitive, perhaps even to our reward dopamine systems, in that we have this desire to be right and to keep having this little dopamine hit.
Right. And another thing that Dr. Burton talked about, and I'm not sure whether I put it in my book or not, is that, our tolerance for uncertainty is very variable. Some of us are okay with uncertainty, and some of us are really uncomfortable with uncertainty. And so that you see that in people's behavior. The people who are uncomfortable with uncertainty are the ones that need to have an answer. It needs to be black and white, and this is it. And of course, most of us learn through experience that most of life is really not black and white. It's gray a lot. And actually, I just interviewed some women about using embodied cognition in education. And one of the things that they pointed out was, and that's a whole different issue, the role of the body interacting with the brain. But our education system is so outdated that it's built on the model that our brain is just doing its own thing and that the body's not important and that you outgrow the use of your body in learning, which is actually backwards from what the science is really showing.
This is something we were also just chatting about in the context of being a scientist. So scientists especially, I think, need to keep an open mind, because although it's generally thought or seen that scientists have the answers or are looking for answers, I think from the side of a scientist, actually, you are aware that the answers are never there. And in fact, when you do research, you're just looking for more questions, not looking for answers.
That's a really great point, Clara, because that's why I love having real scientists on my show, because I want people to get a better understanding of how science is really done. It's not about the answers, it's about the questions, having great questions, getting surprised. But unfortunately, as you, I'm sure, more recently than I have experienced the way science is taught, especially in lower levels of education, like it's a bunch of dry, boring facts. I mean, I think it's amazing that any young people become scientists, given how poorly that it's taught. But fortunately, I guess our underlying curiosity, those of us that are meant to be scientists, somehow get past it. Just, we've seen with COVID that the fact that people don't understand how science is really done is a big problem. If they understood that science is about uncertainty, I mean, there was an awful lot we didn't know. And at the beginning, the experts said things that were wrong. And when they found out that they were wrong, they had to correct them. You're not wishy-washy when you correct. Science is supposed to be self-correcting. And if you can't admit when you're wrong, I mean, that undermines what science is supposed to be about.
Yes, absolutely. Being honest and being open to having your mind changed and learning and evolving, I think, is very crucial to not only science, but as you've mentioned, being a competent citizen in the 21st century. We like to say a lot throughout our podcast, whenever we get a bit more adventurous and speculate, that our opinions are subjective to change, and that nothing we do say is the absolute truth, or it's as far as we know and as well informed as we can be. But I think it's really valuable to allow yourself to have that open-mindedness and to allow yourself to make mistakes. And yeah, as you've mentioned, for the public and for each other to be more forgiving of each other's perspectives and mistakes.
Right. And an interesting point you emphasize is that neuroscience knowledge about this uncertainty that we can't really control because it's unconscious is essential to being a citizen in the world. But I was wondering, if we are open-minded about beliefs, which I agree is a good thing, where can we draw the line to say that a belief shouldn't be had?
Right. That's been a challenge for a long time. I mean, somebody once said that you want to be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brain falls out. And I don't know who originally said that, but it's really true. I mean, it's a challenge. If you really do want to be tolerant, but you also are trying to use some standards of, evidence for deciding what you believe, then it can be tricky when you face someone whose beliefs are, to the knowledge you have, clearly not sustainable by the facts. And I don't know the answer to that. What I would say is the thing that I have noticed that has changed since I was young is that problem has really gotten worse. In the United States Constitution, and I know you guys are in the UK, God is not in the United States Constitution. You wouldn't know it from listening to certain politicians now. Yeah. But God was left out of the Constitution on purpose, because back in those days, people mostly coming from England actually appreciated that if you established a state religion, that you were going to end up persecuting somebody. So when the United States was started, people realized that it was important to take religion out of the equation.
I also wanted to ask you about, you've mentioned your interest in consciousness, and you point out how perhaps the focus shouldn't be on whether or not we can download our memories or like tap into our memories in that sense, but perhaps have a more understanding of the embodied nature of consciousness. And I wanted to ask you to expand a bit more on that, and also on top of that, whether or not you think we are asking the right questions in neuroscience in that aspect. So Elon Musk keeps ranting about how he'll be able to download memories, and perhaps we're not asking the right questions. And if so, what would you propose instead?
Elon Musk is not a neuroscientist.
Yes, he's an engineer.
Have you read Anil Seth?
We're familiar with his work. Yeah.
Okay, because I think he's got a pretty good contemporary grasp on things. I like his beast machine hypothesis, although he doesn't claim that he has a theory, but it's basically takes into account the embodied nature of consciousness. My understanding of consciousness is that it's generated by the interaction of our brain, our body, and the world, right? Because everything we know about the world comes through our body, that is, our sensory system. And so it's that interaction that makes the experience, which is why I often say we are not a brain in the vat, because that's a famous image. There was a movie back in the 80s called All of Me with Lily Tomlin and Steve Martin. It's like that TV show Futurama, where everybody's heads are in those things. Have you seen that either?
No.
Okay. So I might references you don't know, but the idea is that you could have your brain just separate from your body and you would still be able to interact and all. That's just not the case. Now, the brain in the vat model also assumes that somehow you would have inputs into this brain in the vat that would give you the illusion matrix like that you were, really in the world. But the point is that just taking the contents of your brain, even if that was doable, would not be enough. That's the main point, because in and of itself, the brain doesn't know anything without input from the world. The other problem with the whole idea of uploading your consciousness is that it's constantly changing. Your brain is constantly changing. You've heard of the connectome, that's the wiring diagram of the brain. And there are people working on trying to get the connectome. I think they're still at the level of trying to get the connectome for a mouse brain. But even so, if we could extrapolate that to a human brain, we'd still have the problem that it's constantly changing. It's not static like a computer. In terms of people like Musk who are making these claims, I think that they're really, really underrating the complexity of the problem. Even if you leave out the embodiment issue, they're underestimating the complexity of trying to simulate something that's as dynamic and changing.
And unsolved.
Right. But they're going, oh, we'll solve it, and then we'll be able to do this. I mean, that's a big leap.
Yeah. Until we can access and measure and quantify internal states and somehow be able to define consciousness, which is still undefined, I'm not really sure how anyone could ever get to the point to download memories. And neuroscience is not engineering. You can't, make the microchip smaller and smaller and smaller indefinitely. Neuroscience doesn't work that way. You can't force it. You can't.
And I think also the use of the word dynamic that you use, Ginger, is really important here, because like with the connectome, for example, you can study it. It's mainly structural, what you're gaining from that. And also then there's functional methods of studying neuroscience, but the dynamics that combine the structure and function also play a part in the role of the system. So this is another component we're lacking in terms of research.
Yeah.
Something else I wanted to ask was about the fact that so much of our self is unconscious. I was wondering, what are the implications then for something such as free will? If most of what we do is actually unconscious, then can we say that we have control over our actions?
Okay. Yeah, that's a big one. So first of all, I wouldn't say that most of what we do is unconscious. Okay. Most of what our brain does is unconscious. And then obviously there's things like breathing and, our organs working and everything that go on without our conscious involvement. I think the key idea is that many things that become automatic, so they are unconscious, like habits, start out as conscious efforts. So, for example, when you learn how to walk, even though you don't remember learning how to walk, when you learned how to walk, had to work pretty hard at it, like when you learned how to ride a bike, right? You had to think about it. When you learn how to drive a car, it's really hard at first because you're trying to keep track of all the stuff that you have to do. But eventually it becomes automatic to the point where, you can drive home from work and realize that you don't even remember doing it, right? Because you had your mind on your audiobook or whatever you had your mind on. So really things becoming unconscious in that way is really a great thing, because that's what allows us to have the complex lives that we have. Now, we do make choices. For example, you do choose what to study in college. You make these choices. These choices affect your future and they affect your habits. From my point of view, and I realize that not everyone agrees with this, I think that do have choices that then later on we'll do something without thinking, but usually it's because of what we've done in the past that's made that our habitual. Like if you're normally a kind person, you're going to be kind without thinking. You open the door for the person behind you. You don't have to think about that because that's the way you were raised, right? So that's my take on it.
That's a really interesting sort of picture of things coming into the conscious, then being driven into the unconscious, which then influences our conscious.
But I also want to say this: Freud is mostly pseudoscience. Even though he sometimes gets credit for, discovering the unconscious, many of his ideas, have been pretty much disproven. For example, the idea that you repress memories, that is not the thing that usually happens. In fact, most people who have, say, PTSD, their problem is not repressing memories. Their problem is the memories being too strong and them not being able to get them put away where they're not bothering them, so to speak. When I ever talk about unconscious, I always say I'm not really talking about the pseudoscientific unconscious of Freud. I mean, most of the stuff is stuff that you would never have access to, right? I mean, like, I don't need to have access to how my heart is, rate is being controlled by my brain, for example. But that's actually a bad example because it's one of those ones in the gray zone, where some people can get enough awareness to have some control over that. Whereas you could never control, say, the secretion of insulin by your pancreas, right? Most of that unconscious stuff it's not stuff we'd never necessarily even need access to.
It's
right?
interesting you say that because we do have an episode where we discuss autonomous and not autonomous functions. We have not only on our free will versus determinism episode, but also one on
breathing and the brain and being. Yeah.
Where we discuss using your terms and definitions of unconsciousness versus conscious and autonomous versus not autonomous.
And what does it mean when we, as humans, can start to control autonomous so-called unconscious actions like breathing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And so the breath and heart rate are good examples of things, like I said, that are in that gray zone where even if you take people who can somewhat control those things, there's a lot of individuality. Some people would never be able to have any control, and other people take to it really, the whole biofeedback model, some people are really good at that kind of thing, and some people really just don't have enough awareness to even be able to tap into that information.
So to finish off the episode, I would just like to ask one final question, and it'll be a big question, but I would just like to hear your synthesized opinion on it. Taking inspiration from your choice and topic of today's episode, what would you say are the essential things to be a competent citizen in the 21st century from perspective of neuroscience? And what do you think are the essence that should be informed about?
Okay. So I'm going to cheat and use my handout that I'll make available to your listeners. Mm-hmm. I have a handout called 5 Things You Need to Know About Your Brain. I use this as the basis of a talk I gave at a conference last year, and it kind of sums up what I think are the key things. The number one is that your brain creates everything you experience. Now, this may seem like a no-brainer, but it's kind of a really important principle. Without your brain, you don't have experience. when I first started, I actually thought that maybe it was possible there were certain experiences that were not explained by the brain. For example, out-of-body experiences. But then I learned about Olaf Blank's work. He figured out that you can stimulate a certain place in the temporal lobe and make a person have an out-of-body experience. So when I say the brain creates everything you experience, I mean everything. Number 2 is that most of what your brain does is unconscious. I don't think I need to expand on that because we've talked about that one a lot. Number 3 is that your memory, everyone's memory, is unreliable. And we talked a little bit about that, the fact that memory is dynamic, and we automatically put in stuff that we learn between now and whenever we last recalled the memory. Now, you might say, well, this doesn't make sense because it makes our memories inaccurate, but you got to think about, what is the purpose of memory? Is it to give us an accurate biography, or is it for us to survive?
That's a really good question.
Okay, so if we make the assumption that the brain's function, and therefore the memory's function, is survival, accuracy is not as important as incorporating new information. And here's the kicker: you can't tell the difference.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's even been shown that there's this idea that if it was a very emotional memory, like, say, what were you doing when 9/11 happened, then you might have a more accurate memory, but that's actually been disproven. The emotional component does not make your memory more accurate. So that one is really important, even for day-to-day life. How many feuds are caused by people having disagreements about an event in the past?
Right? Yeah.
Number 4, we didn't talk about at all, which is you're wired to be social. And I think if you didn't appreciate this before COVID, you probably appreciate it now. The same part of our brain is stimulated by physical pain as is by social pain, like being rejected by somebody. So most of us need other people. This is both our strength and our weakness, right? It's our strength because it's working together that allows humans to do all kinds of wonderful things and also all kinds of horrible things. So it's a strength and a weakness, but it's definitely how we're wired. And for people who, when they're getting older, being social is probably the number one key to brain health. I mean, learning new things is great, right? But as one of my guests said recently, there's nothing more unpredictable than other people. And the best way to keep your brain agile is to be doing things that are not exactly what you always expect. So that's another consequence of the social part. And then finally, number 5 is you are not a brain in a vat.
As you've mentioned, the only way to perceive the world is through our senses. And so if you remove that, who knows what our perception, if any type of perception is possible at all.
I did want to tell your listeners, how they can get that handout about 5 things about your brain. So this is something I use as a gift to people when they sign up to my Brain Science newsletter. And all you need to do is text the word brain science to, all one word, to 55444. That's brain science, all one word, to 55444. Or if you're not able to do that on your phone, just go to brainsciencepodcast.com and you'll see there how to sign up. And I hope you'll listen to Brain Science in your favorite audio app.
Absolutely.
And we highly recommend it as well.
Yes, one of our favorite neuroscience podcasts.
Yeah.
And we would like to thank you, Dr. Campbell, for joining us on our podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been amazing chatting to you. Thank you.
Well, I'm really glad that you're doing this. I'm so happy to see that there's many new neuroscience podcasts out there now, and I think we complement each other. We need more science podcasts, so way to go.
Absolutely. Thank you.